Please hold for the tone to join your conference.
So that's the first two things, and we're going to go into some details about some of the features of WCF RIA Services and touch on some use cases like hierarchical data, maybe MVVM, how you implement application logic using validation, and how you can recognize who the user is and what they have permission to do. Okay, so why WCF RIA Services? Well, one of the things that you get into when you're building a Silverlight application, especially when you start to do a line of business application, no useful line of business application is without some need for getting and interacting with data. And once you start talking about consuming data within Silverlight, you start to get into some of the complexities. So first of all, the first thing you would notice when you create a service reference is your communication with the service is forced to be async, so you can't do a straight request and reply, which makes it a little difficult to chain service requests. If you've got, say, like a detail view that has a bunch of other data sets that are going to be populating list boxes or combo boxes or something like that. You're restricted in the way that you can consume services, so you're either using something like the web client or HTTP web request and response to build your requests, or you're using the typical basic add service reference functionality within Visual Studio to create your proxy. And the last restriction with consuming services is that the service must be at the site of origin. So if you have a bunch of existing services that you want to leverage within your application, it's not that you can't consume them, it's that you need to negotiate with whoever or wherever those services are hosted in order to be able to access them from the Silverlight client. So there's a little bit of complexity there. It's not unmanageable, but there's a little bit to deal with. One of the other things that kind of comes into play here is that when you're building a line of business application, Silverlight is a tool for building rich internet applications or RIA applications, and that typically means there's a lot of communication between the client and the server. And having a forced end-tier architecture adds a little bit to that complexity. So while it's a good architecture, and I'm not going to argue that Silverlight should be able to you should be able to build a Silverlight application going straight from the client to line of sight to the database. That kind of two-tier architecture does kind of keep things simple and reduces some complexity that way. There are problems with doing that, and not the least of which is exposing your database to any client that's running it. But really, more than that is the kind of things that you need to deal with data access, data entry, such as implementing presentation logic, application logic, things like validation. If you build an ASP.NET web application, you've got the validation controls that let you run validation on the client. And if you've used those before in any kind of production environment, you quickly realize that users have tools now that can sidestep that stuff and modify the information that they're sending you, sidestep that validation, and it gets to you on the server in an invalid state. So you want to implement validation on the server as well. Now you've got the validation living in two different places, which means then if those rules change or are added to, now you've got to maintain it in two different places. So that's kind of a high-level overview of some of the difficulties that you run into when you start to consume services for data access in Silverlight. And those are illustrated in a quick solution that I created here. Let me share my desktop. You guys see that all right? Okay, so this solution has a Silverlight application, and it's a typical Silverlight application, has an ASP.NET host. And what I've done to kind of set this up to illustrate some of the things that I was just describing was I've created a WCF service in my ASP.NET web application. So remember I mentioned that the whole site of origin issue, I'm not going to illustrate that here. That's addressed simply by adding a policy file on the server. But we're going to sidestep that and show the rest of the things that I described. So I have a simple service here that just simulates being able to exposing the operations to be able to create a quick master detail view. So I have an operation that gets a list of stuff. Stuff just has some simple properties, and then I have a detail operation that, given an ID, will go and get the detail view, the detail item. So that's a WCF service, plain and simple, nothing special about it. What I did to get to that within Silverlight was I added my service reference, so it discovers that. And then that's what I use to generate my proxy on the client. So that's what you have here. And along with that, you'll also notice that we have this service references.clientconfig that looks a lot like the system service model node that you're used to seeing in your web config or app config. So all that's cool. It's straight up easy to add a service reference within Silverlight. Nothing special there. And then I started to build out a UI that just had a simple data grid. We can see here. And so this data grid will be responsible for presenting the results from that first operation, the list operation, and then a text block just to simulate some presentation of the detail that we get. So that's just bound. If we take a look at the code behind, we'll start to see some of what I was describing with, here we have chain service calls. So we're going and getting the list of stuff, the first operation, and then right after that we're going to show a detail view on that same page based on the selected item in the grid. So we're going to set the selected item and then make that call. And without having the forced async restriction, you could make the call, you can get the list, and then based on that list you can get an item out of it and make that second call, and you can do everything pretty much within the loaded handler here. But now because we have this async restriction, we have two separate completed handlers. And our access isn't happening right off. So here we have our proxy. Before we can make a call, we need to hook up the method that's responsible for handling those results, and we kick it off. So you've probably seen this. This isn't anything new. I don't need to go into the details about how we're doing what we're doing here. The point really is just to make a simple call to get a list and a simple call to get a single item of that same type. We've got a bunch of stuff here. So you can imagine, a line of business application is usually doing a lot of data access and of a bunch of different entities doing a bunch of different things. So you can see with just two simple calls here that we've already got 60 or so lines of code in one view to manage our service operations. Okay. Back to the slides. Yeah, so we did see that we have the service reference, we have the client config, we have async only, and we have site of origin only. The thing I didn't show you there was the business logic. So let's say there's some sort of restriction around what details can be viewed. And maybe this is very basic just to kind of illustrate the purpose. Here, before we make the call, once we're responding to the list that we get back, we're going to do some sort of application logic that says, hey, if the selected item that I'm looking to ask for is 10, then we want to do something. I don't know if we want to block the user from going and getting it, or if we just want to let them know this is an important item. I don't know, whatever. So you have application logic here. In our service, we have the same thing going on. So once I make that detail call, I have some other, that same application logic duplicated here. So there's an example of that application logic living in two different places and needing to maintain it separately, and that being a little bit of a problem. So of course, we'll go back. we'll go back to the slides, and of course, if that's the problem, then what's the solution, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So WCF RIA Services is a solution, and the reason that we're talking about it is it solves some of the problems that I just described. So it simplifies end-tier development. When you use WCF RIA Services, I guess generally speaking, what it is it's a service like anything else, but it's a special kind of service that is meant to interact with RIA, make RIA clients development easier. So it does that by basically following the model of this WCF RIA service. This domain service is the key class in here, is actually like an application service that uses CodeGen to make itself available to your Silverlight client. So what that means is you create a service on your server and you use it on the client, and it's pretty seamless. So there's no adding service references. There is async, but it handles that under the covers, so you can just hook things up and get the data and not have to worry about processing the request. Also the business, since it's an application service, it's meant to expose operations that your application is going to use. So it's a nice, neat, logical place to put application logic, like the validation stuff that I was alluding to in the previous demo. So you basically define the validation logic in one place, and then that through CodeGen becomes available to you on both the client and inside the domain service. And since you're not adding a service reference, there's no app config to deal with, and there's no concern. Also, because that domain service already lives at the site of origin, there's no thought about the whole cross-domain issue. So I'll walk through. You may also be familiar with this. This is sort of setting the groundwork for the rest of the session. I'll just run through a simple hello world example of using WCF RIA Services, where you basically write one line of code to hook up a Silverlight data grid to a table in your database. And we'll run through this quickly because this is beyond the basics and not hello world, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on the details of this. So essentially what you do with this, I'll kind of walk through just from step one to the end how you get this hooked up. The first thing that you do is you create an entity framework model. So I've got the AdventureWorks database installed locally on my SQL Express instance, and I created a model. I only care about one of the entities in that model, but you can pull in as many as you want. And just to be clear, Entity Framework is not part of WCF RIA Services, but WCF RIA Services leverages it heavily for its what they call the happy path, the best way to leverage WCF RIA Services and get the most out of it. But by the way, one of the things that's really cool about WCF RIA Services is its flexibility. So you can take this happy path, and it's just fine. But if you need to customize it, say to consume maybe existing services, then WCF RIA Services is flexible enough to let you customize that and interact with those services. So step one, create your model. Here I just pulled in one thing. When I did that, everything was hooked up for me outside of RIA Services. Then I went, after I had the model, I built to make sure that it was available, add a new domain service. That domain service, after I build, this wizard will recognize whatever data context, object context classes are available to me within that solution. So we have our entities. So you select the entities model that you want, and then from here you can filter down further to the entities that you want to expose to your application. So if I had pulled in all of the AdventureWorks database, I could just say, this domain service is only meant to interact with contact, so I'm just going to select the contact entity, and that's all. So we're also going to enable editing. So if you don't check this box, then what you get when the domain service is generated is just the get method, the read methods when you check this box, it gives you the ability to update and delete, insert, update, and delete. And the other thing that we want to do to really leverage some cool stuff is to check this box to generate associated classes for metadata. And this gives us a hook into sharing application logic. So I do all of that, name it whatever you want to name it, and then what gets created is this AdventureWorks domain service. And essentially everything that you see here is done, is generated for you, except, I'm not really sure. I did this a little while ago. I'm not sure if this is created for you or not, but I just modified it. I think this might happen out of the box. You might need to, at one point at least, I'm not sure, but at one point you needed to build out what's happening inside these methods. So it would stub out the methods for you, but you needed to provide the implementation. That might still be the case. And if so, well, here's the one line of code that you need to write for the hello world scenario. Since there's thousands of records in this database, and I don't want to pull in thousands of records in my Silverlight application, I'm just, for the purposes of demonstration, I'm just pulling in the first 100. So that's our one line of code. Now we build and we go back to our Silverlight application. When we create our Silverlight app, there's something in the project properties that we can choose to check or set up, and that is our WCF RIA Services link. So that'll be recognized. This will be populated with your ASP.NET host when you build your Silverlight application. Once that's selected, whatever RIA Services stuff you do in your web project is automatically generated for you and available to you in your Silverlight app. And it lives in this generated code folder that's not included in the project. So if we take a look at this, if we were to browse through all of this, we would see the same operations that we had on our AdventureWorks domain service. And when that domain service gets generated and added to the Silverlight application, it gets pulled in as a domain context. So you develop it as a domain service, and it's available to you in Silverlight as a domain context. So no, you don't see any client, you don't see any config file here, you don't see any service references, it's just the generated code. So now I'm going to have a view here, my Hello World view, which is just a straight data grid that's not going to do anything but present the contacts. So I drop a data grid onto my view, and I use the new data sources tab. I think this was available with Visual Studio 2010. So this again isn't a RIA Services thing. It just recognizes the sets that RIA Services makes available. I have a couple of different things here for demonstration, but this is the one that we just created. So there's our AdventureWorks domain context, and there's our contact entity. So all I did was come over here to the Data Sources tab, take this contact and drag it onto the data grid. And when I do that, it adds a bunch of references to what it needs in order to be able to create, that's the data grid, in order to be able to create this domain data source object. So this is not a visual element. If you're familiar with data sources like you use in ASP.NET, it's the same thing. And in fact, RIA Services gives you also an ASP.NET domain data source that you can use on the web side of things. And I let it do everything that it needed to do by default, and it created all this for me. So you can see the domain context is our AdventureWorks domain context. And the way this kind of works is there's the query for get contact, and the data grid is set up with its item source pointing to this named element, so it's using element binding going to the data property. So I haven't written anything yet except for just my implementation of the get. This code is generated for me, but all it is just for error handling, so there's no real moving parts going on there. So now when we debug this, when we run it, we'll see a data grid populated with contacts with only having to implement the details of the get contacts query. There's a lot of ugly stuff there because I didn't control what columns were being returned. And you can see. So check this out as well. This is some cool stuff. The data source back here. So name style was a checkbox in the data grid. We didn't tell the data grid to do anything. We just said automatically generate your columns. So what it does is it looks at the data sources, it looks at the schema, and recognizes name style is a Boolean value. Modified date is a date, so it provides what it needs in the data grid to be able to present that. So all that's as easy as it gets. So something to think about here. Actually, I'll run it one more time. Is that is the happy path. Added to that are some extra things, some extra functionality if you want to extend it further, and I think we're going to talk about that in the next. But you have simple sorting, filtering, and paging that you can add to with this that is also enabled really easily with WCF RIA Services. Okay, so when I was thinking about, okay, we're doing beyond the basics, so now after about 20 minutes or so now we're going to start to talk about more of the details of WCF RIA Services and how you can customize it and some of the things that are provided for you that make it a little bit easier. And, I thought about it and I'm like, well, Brad Abrams did over a 20-entry blog series about WCF RIA Services and how to do everything from start to finish with it. So why reinvent the wheel? So I'm kind of structuring how I'm going through this similarly to the way that he did. At the end, I'll give you a link to his blog series, and you can go through and pull out specific details. So I hope that some of the stuff that I talked about today you might not get from soup to nuts, but you'll know that it's available, and then you can use that as a reference to dig deeper to further customize. So he kind of put it together in terms of Silverlight line of business applications, and I think that's a really good idea because that's where RIA Services really shows the power of what it can do. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the Silverlight business application project template. And I'm not sure if that gets installed with the tools or if that's part of the toolkit or if that's a project template that gets created by RIA Services. But if you go to File, New Project, and choose the Silverlight category, you'll see a Business Application Project template. And that's the one that you want to use if you're building Silverlight line of business applications, because in addition to automatically being hooked up with the RIA Services stuff, there's a lot of boilerplate things that are handled for you, like automatically hooking into your membership and roles providers through an authentication domain service, and providing some UI for you for login and registration and error handling and stuff. And that's part of the first category here, which is the professional feel. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I might review it as part of a different demo. But really what this means is, okay, you're building a line of business application, but it doesn't have to be ugly. It doesn't have to look ugly. If you don't have a designer to make it look nice for you, you should be able to build a line of business application that presents well. And that's really what the business application project template helps you to do. So professional feel also includes the stuff like error handling. So if your application blows up, is it going to crash? Is it going to crash the Silverlight app, or is it going to show you a nice friendly message about what went wrong? Also, one of the most important things with line of business applications is the rich data query. So users are looking at a lot of data, trying to find whatever it is that they're looking for. So you want to be able to give them the ability with the least amount of effort to get a bunch of data, sort, page, filter, do whatever they need to do to be able to find what it is that they're looking for, with a minimal amount of effort on both the user's part and the developer's part to set that up. And you don't get very far within a Silverlight line of business or any line of business application before you run into the need to be able to ensure that the user has access to this stuff or gate them from having access to it, as well as implementing application logic for whether or not the data that they're updating is valid. So that kind of goes, that validating data update and authentication kind of go together. You want to be able to tell who they are. You want to be able to tell if they're authenticated or not and what roles they have, for example, so that you can lock down different areas of your site. And lastly, if we have time, we'll talk about supporting different views, and this can mean a bunch of different things. So it could be using the same domain service for multiple front ends. So I mentioned the ASP.NET domain data source. So you build a domain service once, and it can be consumed by both Silverlight and ASP.NET. It could also mean presenting some sort of view of your application for somebody who doesn't have Silverlight loaded, and that's the way that Brad Abrams did his demo at Mixin PDC, which was to show you what your application would look like if you didn't have Silverlight installed, and giving search engines the ability to crawl your site and get some idea of what the structure is, be able to index it. Okay, so we talked about professional feel, so here's some examples. The data form is a very cool control that I don't know where that comes from. I'm pretty sure it's not from RIA Services. But what's cool about this is it's really just a control that you can drop on the page and just like you do with the data grid, drag a data source over to it and drop it on there, and it presents an individual view. We talked about the domain data source, and we'll go over some of the things that some of the properties of the domain data source that you can use to further customize. And then that boilerplate code from the business application for login and registration. So also in keeping not just with the structure of Brad Abrams' blog series, but also with the demo application that he created, I've grabbed his Foodie Explorer application. We can use that as an example to show some of this stuff. So if you go to So that's the Silverlight business application is the project template that you want to create, that you want to use to create your Silverlight application. That does a bunch of stuff. So it's got resources for consistent presentation of messages throughout the system. Hooks you up with the home and about and main page views. Does the navigation application, the Silverlight navigation application, so it uses the navigation service to be able to load and unload views. Let's just run this, and I'll show you the professional feel, and we can move on to more of the RIA Services stuff. So you have styles already built in, and those styles you can swap out with your own or somebody else's. I think there's a library of styles that are meant to be used within this this business application, and you've got structure to your application, so it's exposing different pages, and support for authentication. So here's a view that lets you log in. I'm not registered, and if you're not registered, it also gives you the ability to register. Oh, I'm still in the PowerPoint. Shoot. Sorry about that, guys. That's all right. This is not anything with RIA Services. So this goes under professional field. So we can see something in this view here that uses RIA Services, and we'll go into detail with that with the rich data query. Just wanted to show some of the presentation. So these styles can be swapped out, and login gives you some boilerplate code for child windows. And if I give it garbage, it also gives me a nice, instead of bombing out on the navigation service, gives me a nice error message. Now, maybe not necessarily user-friendly, but at least, from a developer perspective, you can get some stuff. And you can, to find out what the error was, and you can also customize this. Okay, so that was a quick review of professional feel. Okay, so next, and probably one of the biggest category here, is the rich data query. So I already kind of described what that means. The user has the need to pull in a bunch of data, whatever they decide they need, and filter through it to find the one thing or the set of things that are wrong. So you want to give them the ability to sort, filter, and page is kind of what rich data query means. And that's enabled through the iQueryable interface. So instead of returning a list of objects for your service operations, you return iQueryable, and that gives you the ability, when it's implemented, and because we're using the link to entities domain service, gives you the ability to continuously add different parameters to the query to modify the results, so it makes it link friendly. A data pager control that's included, I think, with the SDK that lets you control how many results to display per page and how many results to load all at once, so you can do some client paging easily. And filter descriptors that let you pass parameters to your iQueryable method. So this is really, I might spend a little bit of time in here. This is really where we start to see some of the cool stuff that RIA Services can do. So in this example, we have our data grid. So we've defined columns. I did it again. That's because I got my slideshow uploaded. Okay, so now we're all on the same page. We're seeing the same thing. So this home view, this is the view that shows. So basically, this application shows a list of restaurants, and then inside the restaurants, you can drill into a restaurant and view the stuff that's on the menu, and get the detailed view also of the stuff that's on the menu. So this is a little bit of the hierarchical data that I mentioned at the beginning of the session. Here we have restaurants, drill down into restaurants and get plates. Click on plates, and we get a detail. So we get the master detail view as well. So what I want to show here is a little bit of how I'm going to do two things. So before I show you how this is put together, I want to show you how it's working. So first page, this is our list of restaurants. Not all that pretty, but like I said, you can use the styles to control the presentation to be better, and that's something that you can cut out of your development handoff to a designer. So there's a simple filter here for postal code, and we can see a few postal codes over here. I'm going to type in 7, and we're going to see that when the text changes, now the results are filtered down. Now instead of having 5 pages, we have 2. And that's just on text change. So if I filter that further, 7, 8, now we're down to a single page. Now if I back that up, I've got 2 pages. Type an A. I got nothing. Yeah, okay. So all this, as a user right now, maybe I don't know what I'm looking for, but I'm just going through a bunch of different ways of filtering through the data to find something that I like. Okay, so I've got 2 pages of stuff here, and I want to be able to, I want to sort it. I want to start at the top of the list based on who I'm going to be talking to. Maybe I want to give them all a call. And when you do that sorting, you would expect the sort not to happen just within the single page that we're viewing, but across the whole set of, in this case, 2, or if I back up, everything. So now my contact names are sorted alphabetically, and if I go all the way to page 5, we'll see that we've got the S, W, and Ys. And we really didn't do anything other than, I'll show you the filter. So as far as sorting goes, that's supported by the data grid. That's not a RIA Services thing. But because that sorting is happening and the item source is our domain context, it's leveraging WCF RIA Services to repopulate that data grid and do the sort in the right order and present the right page. Yeah. Okay, so now let's have a look at how that's, what little we need to do to hook that up. So we have our data pager that comes from the SDK. We have our data pager that's tied to the same source, our domain data source, as our grid. And all we're doing with the paging is just saying, here's our page size. We want to display 10 results per page. That's all you've got to do to hook up paging. And then we'll notice down here, so we've seen from the Hello World example, we've seen the domain data source, and now we see a little bit more stuff there than we did with the basic use case, and that's this. One of those things is a list of filter descriptors. So the way the filter descriptors work, so this is something that's provided by RIA Services, is you basically create this collection of filter descriptors on your data source. and each filter descriptor can provide an operator, which is contains, equals, anything. Let me stop debugging and I can show you examples of the options that are there, so you don't have to guess at what you need to provide it. So all of these, you just choose one that you want. So we're using contains. The property path. This property path is the property on your data object. So if the data grid is meant to present a list of restaurants, then that restaurant type has a postal code property on it. That's what you're defining here. And then the last thing you provide is, okay, where am I going to get the value that I want to see, whether or not postal code contains. And that's where you do element binding to our text box up here. So if you wanted to add more filter descriptors, you just add more controls that let the user enter whatever values they want and bind them to various properties. So we can add a filter descriptor for city or state, and then that automatically ties into our domain data source and does the filtering. Now, one of the questions you might have next is, how does it do that then? So I've got this filter descriptor, and it's great that I've hooked it all up, but how does that end up turning into a list of results that match my filter? So for that, we want to have a look at what we did with this domain data source and talk a little bit more about the iQueryable interface. So here's our domain data source. We've got, just like in the demo, we have our CRUD methods. And just like in the demo, we're returning from the entity set, the object set from our link to entities domain service. So the link to entities domain service is an extension of the base domain service class. So if we're talking about, one of the things that you might want to do is leverage existing services. You don't want to use link to entities. You don't want to use the entity framework because you already have a library of existing services that other applications are using, and you maybe want to be able to leverage those and expose those through a domain service. And you can do that by just creating a new basic domain service and not using any entity framework model or link to SQL stuff. Now, so that's easy enough on the surface, but then here is where the devil's in the details. So if we start to talk about the functionality that we just saw in that demo, what we saw was a data grid that was bound to the results of this query, this get restaurants query. And then we had filter descriptors defined on that domain data source. And those filter descriptors are automatically being passed along through to that operation. So we can see here the initial population of restaurants. Now if we say 7, we can see the breakpoint gets hit on that again. Now, here's something that's interesting. So we have our restaurants object set. We already have a link query specified that we're going to return restaurants where the region is not North Carolina, and we want it ordered by ID. But we just also told it that we want to add an additional where clause to that where the postal code contains 7. We don't see that anywhere here, and it's really hard to find any kind of evidence of that parameter. But we see that it hits it, and we can see now that we have 2. So now we can sort by contact name just with a simple sort. So that's functionality that's provided by the data grid that WCF RIA Services is leveraging. It's listening. I'm not sure how it does it, so I'm not going to speculate, but it passes it along basically, because this is iQueryable, you can modify the parameters. It passes those parameters along back to the original query that you used to populate the data grid, and then it takes the parameters that you gave to it, the filter descriptors and sort descriptors that you gave to it, and merges it with whatever you have defined in your implementation to build one query that it then goes against your database and gets the values. So if you're following me with me saying that the devil is in the details, here is an example of that. So we talked about what you would need to do to customize it, and you only need to do You only need to, instead of inheriting from the link to entities, use a more basic class, the domain service. When you do that, now you don't have the entity framework underneath you to automatically handle this specific case. So maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the work that's involved in customizing in creating your own domain service that doesn't use link to entities. About 10 minutes. I don't want to spend too much longer on this, but I want to touch on this because this does go into some depth. Okay, so back to the original demo that I showed for the solution to the Silverlight line of business development problems that I described, where we have our basic hello world case, but I also, inside that same solution, inside that same Silverlight application, did this custom version that basically does the same thing, but uses a plain old WCF service that the domain service exposes. So the domain service is sort of a facade for this. So you can see here, instead of taking 100 like I was in the demo, we're taking 4,000. You don't see 4,000 here. Okay, so I'll show you what I did. So to simulate this, here the Adventure Work service in this solution is your existing WCF service. And here's our Silverlight application that has a RIA service link to its host here, Hello World Web. And inside there, I've created this AdventureWorks basic domain service. So first, I've added a service reference. So you can consume the service however you want to. To keep it simple for the demo, I added a service reference. And I've created this basic domain service that just inherits from domain service. So what does it take? So if the key to having that cool automatic sorting and filtering and all of that stuff, and the tight link between your Silverlight front end and the domain service, is the iQueryable interface. So what does it take to expose your operations as iQueryable? Well, at a really, really, really basic level, and I'll demonstrate why, not necessarily the best way to do this, is to take your array that you get back and call the asQueryable method, and then you can do whatever you want. So I'm taking those 4,000 records that I'm getting from the database, and I'm only taking 100 of them every time. So let's run this again. So I've got a breakpoint here in my domain service, and I've got a breakpoint in my contact, my existing WCF service, and we can see sort of how it works, but might not be as efficient as it should be. So I'm calling my domain service for the initial load that passes through to my existing WCF service. That gets 4,000. So this basically doesn't have any kind of support for sorting or filtering the data. It's just every time it's getting all of the contacts that are in the database. So now I want to sort by last name. Well, I'm hitting again, just like you would expect. I'm hitting the domain service again, but because my implementation isn't linked to entities and it's this WCF service, unless I do something right here to intercept the parameters that are being passed to this request, so the sort request to sort by, what was it, first name? Unless I do that, I'm still getting the same 4,000, not sorted at all here. So I'm sorting within this existing result set of 4,000 to grab the top 100. You also notice, check that out. It's not really sorted. Okay? So the next level down that you can go, so not very useful, because while it is iQueryable, it's not really iQueryable, and it's not really listening to what you're asking it to do. It's just executing the same thing every time. So the next level down is to provide a query provider for the type that you're returning. And then you use it to handle those requests. Now this is still inefficient because I didn't fully build out this query provider. I just kind of wanted to give you an indication of where this was going when you move away from the link to entities implementation into your own custom implementation. If you don't need the sorting and filtering and stuff on the front end and you just need something that simplifies service access, no additional work. WCF RIA Services is cool that way. If you want to be able to leverage that stuff, then you need to go down this path, and this can be a little bit of a rabbit hole. So we're going to see something different here because what we're doing is we're grabbing, instead of taking the 100, we're going to grab from contacts where the last name equals Smith. So now I've hit my domain service. So again, I'm grabbing the same 4,000 as before, so we still haven't stepped over to this side to deal with those sort and filter parameters. And then we're executing a link query on those results to get just ones with the last name of Smith. So we're not taking 100, we're just taking all Smiths from that 4,000, from those 4,000 results. So some of the implementation, I'll spend just a little bit because we're at about 11 o'clock drilling into this implementation. So it starts with queryable custom contact data, this class. Let's take a look at what that does. So that implements this interface. You know what I should have done too, so I grabbed this from an MSDN article and started to customize it so I understood what it would take to do this. And I should have provided that link at the end, but you can hit me up on my email, through my email address to get access to that if you can't find it. So that in turn requires you to define a query provider, and that's the thing that really does the work. That and some helpers with custom expression visitors based on the properties that you want to be supported through the iQueryable interface. So the custom contact query provider is the thing that creates the query based on the expression and executes it. So this is the thing that would then be responsible for knowing what to do with this, basically. So there is a lot of detail in here. If this is a problem you need to solve, if this is a problem that you're interested in solving, there is some guidance out there on MSDN. I think I did a search for linked query provider, I think is what I did. I can look it up. So like I said, if you're interested in getting more detail, I can look it up for you and give you the link if you can't find it. Okay. One more thing that's kind of interesting with this, and maybe that, let's see. Yeah, I'll handle both of those at once, and we'll just skip that. So one thing, the next thing that's cool is, okay, you went through all of that, you know, you understand what you need to do to make your domain service really support iQueryable so that you can provide your own custom implementation without losing any of the functionality that we demonstrated in the Hello World case. The second is data validation. So just in general, outside of the basic use case, in general, when we're talking about line of business applications, we want to make sure that the data that the user is entering when we give them the ability to update is valid data. So we've got application logic that does things like checks a range. So is this value between 0 and 100? Is the user required to enter a value here? How long should the string be? It needs to match this regular expression, you know, et cetera. But there's also stuff for presentation for, you know, whether or not you should display this property. Is this property read-only? And those are things that the data form control that I mentioned in the presentation professional feel section of this, that's where the data form takes a look at that stuff for you and automatically generates your detail view based on these attributes. So if you have something as read-only, then it gets presented, but it gets presented either as either as a label or as a disabled text box, right? So that's some pretty cool stuff. One of the problems with, did I do that right? One of the problems with building line of business applications in Silverlight or with the RIA scenario is sharing or needing to maintain that application logic in two different places. And this kind of solves that, or there's a way to solve that. So you remember when we created our, let me switch over to my desktop, and this will be my last demo. So remember when we created our domain service, we pointed it to the entity model that we were going to use in the Hello World scenario. We pointed it to the entity model that we were going to use, and then we checked that box at the bottom to enable metadata. And this is the partial class that lets you define all of this kind of stuff. So we'll run this scenario and see the validation working, hopefully. So we can see things like name is a required field, so if I don't enter in anything in there, it should fail. It also gives you the display order. So this is useful as well with the data form, because like we saw when I bound the contact to that data grid, that contact info was huge, was wide enough that it took up the whole width of the data grid, and I needed to scroll right to see anything else. Maybe I want that display order to be last. So if I add some metadata here, then it will read that and take care of it. So range validation is as you would expect. Bottom boundary, upper boundary, regular expression. You can change the way a property is displayed, is presented. And let's show how this works. Right. So I'm going to also stick a few breakpoints in here. I think I want to do that one. Just in case, I'll do that. Because we want to see when, because the client and the server are so tightly coupled, this is a good pattern to follow when you're building your application to help you further understand when you're stepping across that boundary back onto your server. Just for learning and development purposes. So I'm going to choose one of these, and that's going to load up my detail view. Now name, remember, was required, so when I remove this and I tab out, we see that we've got a little validation message here. Please provide name, which corresponds to the error message text that we define in our metadata. So you have complete control over how that gets presented on the client. And that's not a RIA Services thing. That just leverages the way Silverlight does data binding. If we take a look at the layout of this, we can see some of the properties that we have on the binding that really enable this. So here's our name. There's our path. Notify on validation error, validates on exception. Those are the keys those are the key things that you need to do in order for that to be lit up. And that's also, this isn't any kind of, this is just what comes out of the box with the text box. When you use a text box and you point at this to something and that binding causes some sort of an exception, this is what you get. Is just add some extra stuff in order to be able to tap into it. Okay, so we have to provide a name. There was also a price validation that was a range that says I want the prices to not be greater than 1,000. So if I make that 1,101, I'm going to get a validation error. Now you also notice here that since I stuck those breakpoints in the domain service for update, that this isn't hitting the server. This isn't going back to the host to run this validation. This validation is happening on the client. But it's defined as part of the metadata on the server. So that means you change it on the server and it's automatically available for you on the client. No need to try to update it and deal with it in two different places. So now when I go to save, I can't because it's not valid. I want to talk about that custom validation next. That's the last thing for something that's beyond the basics. Okay, so now we hit our update. And the other thing that's cool about this is the way WCF RIA Services does updates, you know, I can make this change here. I can go up and I can choose a different detail view, and I can make a change here, and I can choose a different item and see a different detail view and make that update. When I hit save, it's going to update those everything that I've modified. So submit changes takes whatever is changed, and that's what gets pushed back to the server. So you're not pushing back the whole result. So one last thing. So we have these there's metadata defined for simple things like what's the name that I want to display, what's the error message that I want to display, is it read-only or not, required, range, regular expression, all of that stuff. But what if you got some sort of application logic that doesn't fall in any of those boxes? You can use custom validation, define a type that encapsulates your rule, a method to call on that type, and then that validation is hooked up. So that's something that's defined on the server, and you also want to be available to you on the client, but because this is a separate class, it's not automatically done for you. So what you do is you create this validation rules class, have a static method that returns a validation result. That method name is the string that you see here as the parameter for custom validation. And then inside there you implement your application logic. If it fails, you return a new validation result. There's your message. Otherwise, it'll return validation result success. So now this, if we didn't do what I already did to make it available to Silverlight, this would run on the server. You would be able to attempt an update, but then it would kick it back to you because it's not available on the client. So what you need to do to make it available on the client is just as simple as renaming the file to include a .shared extension to it. So the .shared extension tells WCF RIA Services when it's doing its code gen to get the domain context and types and everything out there to your Silverlight application, also include this file. So we did see that running with that description that wasn't available. So this has 3 words. The custom validation rule says it needs to have 5. So when I tab out, now it's going to break on me. So when I tab out, it's supposed to give me a validation message, and it doesn't. So I wonder if maybe I need to change something. Yeah, that's what happened. I didn't change it. I was having some trouble getting ready for this demo because this part wasn't working, and I couldn't figure out why, and I just discovered it's because the value didn't change. So it doesn't run validation unless the value changes. So there's our validation error that's running on the client. You can also see again that we didn't go back to the server for that. Okay, so we did run a little long. This next topic anyway. Oh shoot. Okay, so I won't walk through a demo of this. I'll just describe it because it's really dead simple. It's as simple as the data form. So the data form you just drag on the page and also drag your data source onto it, and automatically builds an edit view for you, or a detail view for you. Accessing user information and being able to determine whether they're authenticated or not and what roles they have is just as easy. So if you use the business application project template, then you get all of that stuff done already for you, and the only thing you need to do is just make the changes to your web config that you need to make in order to support your own authentication and roles providers. It's really that easy, and the rest just taps into it. And then the way that you use that on your service is either on the service itself or on individual operations. You have a requires authentication, and I think the other one is requires roles, or there's some role attribute as well where you specify which roles are available. So what that does is it's a little bit less of a user experience. You have no way of really preventing the user from hitting that service unless you do your own secondary check on the client. So if they try to access a service or a service operation that they don't have access, they don't have permissions for, then it just throws an exception message with a window.alert that says you don't have permissions for this. It's really that easy to do. So the beyond the basics there is plugging in your own membership and roles provider, which is not a WCF RIA Services thing. It's just a regular ASP.NET thing. Okay, and the different views kind of falls under the same category as the professional feel. It's not something really that's WCF RIA Services, although it sort of enables it in some cases, the MVC and ASP.NET cases, where you have a domain service that you create on your host on your ASP.NET application, and just like you had a Silverlight domain data source control in your Silverlight app, you have a ASP.NET domain data source control so that you consume and set up in a similar way. So that lets you create a domain service that can be used by multiple different front ends. And is also what can enable search engine indexing and presenting an alternate view if somebody doesn't have the Silverlight plugin installed. So what we covered today was a review of what makes building line of business applications, some of what makes building line of business applications in Silverlight difficult or complex, and a little bit about how WCF RIA Services makes that easier through the Hello World scenario where you write one line of code and you're off and running. And then we kind of broke down some of the features of, well, line of business applications in general, but mostly WCF RIA Services to talk about the different must-haves. So we talked about controls, we talked about how to get data and how to provide a way for the user to be able to easily navigate through that data to find what they're looking for, as well as ways of authorizing the user to be able to get or update data and providing application logic around that, sharing that application logic from between the client and the server. And each one of those, I tried to show you some examples of how to take it just a step further beyond the Hello World scenario. So I thought if you're interested in some of this, if anything that I talked about today kind of caught your ear, a problem that you've got to solve or a problem that you're looking to investigate further, check out some of these links. Brad Abrams is the authority. Even though he's not with Microsoft anymore, he's still the authority when it comes to WCF RIA Services. Simply because of that whole huge blog series. If you're interested in this, if it looks like it's easy to use, something that you want to try out, then go and download it. You can get it from the Silverlight.net site. Check out the documentation on MSDN. And if you've got any questions, you can contact me at my email address there.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you, everyone, for for being so patient with us while we fixed our technical difficulties. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in at this time. We had one question that came through, and it is, can I use this when developing a Windows Phone 7 application?
Yeah, you can. You have to jump through some hoops right now. So they recognize that this is something that that users are going to want to be able to do on Windows Phone. The version that we have right now doesn't support it out of the box, but there is, if you hit me up at my email address, I can point you in the direction of what you need to do to a couple of references, what you need to do to be able to hook up your domain service to be supported in a Windows Phone environment, and what you need to do to your Windows Phone application in order to be able to leverage that.
Great, thank you. If there are no further questions, we'd like to thank Robert again for this wonderful presentation. Again, we will be forwarding out the recorded version of the presentation when it becomes available. If you have no further questions, or if you have any further questions, please feel free to email Robert at the email listed on the slide. And now you're all free to disconnect. We look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. Thank you.